Tonight on Greater Boston, Joseph Jabir Pope was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole for a murder everyone, including the state, agrees he did not commit. Now he's fighting for a new trial, but as the Globe Spotlight report shows, he's far from alone in his situation. He joins me for his first broadcast interview, along with his attorney that's just ahead. Then later, Ukrainian refugees are getting the green light in the U.S., while others fleeing war and atrocities seem to face hurdle after hurdle. Do we have a refugee double standard? And is the media, at least in part, to blame? Back in 2009, Timothy Brown was hanging out with a group of friends at his apartment when one of those friends decided to rob two brothers he knew in Lowell. Brown chose not to go. But when his friends asked him to lend them hoodies and a gun, he did. The friends ended up killing those brothers, and everyone involved was charged with murder, including Timothy Brown, who was sentenced to life without parole, even though he was nowhere near the murder scene. That's because Massachusetts law at the time said that anyone who participated in a felony, such as knowingly giving people clothes and a gun for an armed robbery, can be convicted of first-degree felony murder, even if they were not involved in the taking of a life. Brown appealed his conviction, and in 2017, the state's highest court, the SJC, ruled that going forward, prosecutors seeking a felony murder conviction would have to prove a defendant acted with the intent to kill or seriously hurt someone. As for Brown's specific case, the court reduced his conviction to second-degree murder, making him eligible for parole after 15 years. But the new landmark ruling brought about by his case did not automatically even set him free. It was not retroactive. His mother recently told the Boston Globe, "I'll be totally honest, I get very bitter at the situation. I think the punishment should fit the crime," and he did not commit the crime. And as the Globe highlights in their new Spotlight series, Unfinished Justice, Brown is far from alone. Their review of a few hundred cases going back to the 70s found at least 23 men sentenced to life in prison in Massachusetts for murders that judges, juries, and prosecutors all agreed they did not commit. And there may be many more. Among them is Joseph Jabir Pope, a U.S. Marine vet who was convicted of felony murder in connection with a 1984 armed robbery and has been fighting the legality of that conviction since almost 30 years before the Brown ruling changed everything. He has served 37 years in prison. He's out now, temporarily at least, while his argument is being considered by the High Court. Joseph Jabir Pope joins me, along with his attorney, Jeffrey Harris. Jeffrey's been on the show before representing Frederick Clay and Tyrone Clark, both of whom he helped set free after decades in prison for murders they both have always maintained they did not commit. Joseph Pope, good to meet you. Jeffrey Harris, good to see you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Joseph, I can start with you. What were you doing in that Dorchester house in 1984 when Efrain de Jesus was murdered?
In a phrase, a drug transaction.
Mm-hmm. And did you have anything to do with the murder of Mr. de Jesus? Were you anywhere near Efrain de Jesus when he was murdered?
Nothing at all to do with the murder, nor was Mr. de Jesus ever robbed.
Mm-hmm. And did you know anything about felony murder laws or anything like that at the time of this life-taking?
Not in any depth, no.
Mm-hmm. Jeffrey, is any of the players involved in this matter dispute the notion that Mr. Pope did not commit this murder?
No, everyone agrees that he was upstairs when the murder was committed downstairs. So in that way, we have a pretty clear-cut case.
So what are the vehicles for addressing what the SJC itself, as I said a minute ago, was something that needed fixing? And to repeat, they fixed it prospectively, not retroactively. What are the vehicles for the Joseph Popes of the world who want to challenge these life without parole sentences for murders they did not commit?
Well, sadly, there's no really obvious way to do it. We've done what we can do with respect to challenging the felony murder rule, but as you noted in the Brown decision, the court said that it was prospective only. And so they seem to some extent, have cut off any relief for anyone who has already been convicted. But we argue that the rule should be changed because the court has the power to change the rule, and they do change rules like this often. And if the rule gets changed, hopefully there will be some limited retroactive effect that would apply to people in Mr. Pope's circumstance, who not only challenged this rule throughout and said, this isn't right, even at the time of trial, even 30 years before Brown.
Yeah.
But also today, the Commonwealth acknowledges that if there was ever going to be a case for retroactivity, that this is that case. And they said that in open court, and they recognize that they're not prejudiced by retroactive effect in this case.
You know, Jeffrey, I want to stay with you 1 minute and stay with the SJC, and then we'll go beyond them to the governor and legislature in a couple of minutes. One of the things I don't understand, Jeffrey, and maybe you can't answer this question either, the SJC's contention, please correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of the retroactivity, is it's not fair to have our ruling apply retroactively because prosecutors in these cases didn't have to prove that there was intent to harm. Maybe they could have proved intent to harm, but since they didn't even have that element as a required element, it's not fair. What I want to know from you is, then why didn't they require or order new trials in all of these cases like Joseph Pope's and allow the people who had been convicted to prove that there was no intent to harm, no intent for malice?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jim, that would be, I think, probably the most just outcome is someone who is convicted on a now illegitimate theory shouldn't stay in prison. But there doesn't seem to be any question that in this case, Mr. Pope was not a part of the murder. So there shouldn't be any, this is a clear application of that. And the Commonwealth has said that they don't have, that they, even if they had been on notice that they have to prove malice, in Mr. Pope's case, they couldn't have proven it.
Well, I want to,
so they were already on notice. They're not prejudiced in this case.
I want to go back to you, Joseph Pope, for a second. 37 years in jail to at least this temporary release. Did you think you would die in prison?
When I was being processed out, a caseworker asked me if I ever thought that this day would come. And my response to her was that I always fought for this day to come. I didn't have the luxury of giving up, because giving up would have just simply meant to die in prison, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So I hoped and I prayed and I strived and I stayed focused on the possibility that this day would come.
I want to talk about that focus. You have a really powerful quote that you gave to the Boston Globe Spotlight team. You say, innocent prisoners generally do time differently than guilty prisoners. I know that because I've been both, you said. Those that are guilty tend to resolve themselves to their fate and on some level even find relief. With innocent prisoners, there's a hunger and rage that accompanies us on a regular basis. How do you deal with that hunger and rage on a regular basis when you don't know if there's ever going to be an end point?
It's something that drives you. It's like, I've been asked that question among my peers and in various groups that I've involved in. And I have likened it in some cases, for example, to fatherhood. I don't get to stop being a father. I love my children, and I don't get to stop being a father, no matter what. And it's the same thing with this. I didn't have the luxury of stopping to fight for my freedom. I was haunted by the fact that I was in prison for something that I really did not do, and that I was convinced that all parties that was involved knew that. That's why rage has been my constant companion for the period of time that I've been incarcerated.
How did it feel, even though you don't know if it's temporary or not, how did it feel when you walked out that door and I believe you were greeted by Jeffrey Harris? What did that feel like?
It was an extraordinary moment. It was a moment that I wasn't sure was actually happening until maybe my first bite of a donut in Dunkin' Donuts or something like that. And I'm still adjusting because I still live in a gray area. Because the Supreme Court has not made a decision, I don't have the luxury of making long-term plans or long-term commitments because I just don't know how the court will rule.
Yeah.
But for the period of time that I am out, I am going to try to do some good. I want to make a contribution to my community in the hopes of turning the young away from the road that leads to prison and in other positive contributions that I can make.
You know, Jeffrey Harris, I want to go back to you. Kevin Hayden, the interim Suffolk County DA, was on our radio show on March 30th. And I didn't ask him specifically about Mr. Pope's case, but I did ask him about the whole issue of how to treat these felony murder convictions, again, for people who had nothing to do with the murder, who were swept up in the felony murder law retroactively. And here's a little bit of what DA Hayden had to say.
I do think that we need to look at how to appropriately and properly retroactively approach some of these cases on a case-by-case basis. I can understand where Justice Gantz ruled as he did in terms of retroactivity, because I think part of his point was, well, we don't know how the case might have been tried differently without the felony murder rule in place, which doesn't require any show of malice. Other states have led the way with legislative fixes here, and I think a legislative fix will be appropriate here as well.
What do you take away from what Kevin Hayden had to say, Jeffrey?
Well, that's a very welcome position, I would say. I mean, I'm glad that him and several DAs, as the Globe noted, around the state have seem to be open to case-by-case review, which is not retroactive effect of the new law that came out with Brown, but you know, it's certainly something. And I asked them before we went to the court in this case, before the SJC argument, whether or not they were willing to reverse their position on the felony murder issue in Mr. Pope's case. And I didn't hear anything back at that point. So that was their position in January. But it looks like it's changed now, which is nice.
So will you pursue relief in that forum as well through the Suffolk DA in addition to the matter you have before the SJC, Jeffrey?
Well, that's sort of what I was saying. I already have. I went to them and I said, do you want to look to review this? Okay. And because we might be able to work out something before, but
how about, well, also, you know that the governor, for the first time, the outgoing governor, obviously 2 commutations recently. Is that a possibility in this matter?
Well, I guess I want to say this isn't your clear-cut case of the proverbial getaway car. I don't think this actually does fall into the kind of cases you're talking about. This is actually an innocence case. Mr. Pope says, I was never engaged in any kind of armed robbery or anything of the sort. But so we're trying to get his conviction vacated completely, because he didn't do it. Not that he should be sentenced to something else or there should be some other charge. He is innocent. So I'm not, that's our position.
Understood. Joseph Pope, do you fear a loss here and return to where you've spent more than 37 years of your life?
Of course. Over the span of 37 years, I've suffered a great deal of losses. And that's been my journey up to this point. And so I know that tomorrow is not promised to me like it's not promised to anyone else. And of course, there's a possibility that I could return to prison.
You know, one last thing for you, Joseph, is, you know, one of the cruel ironies of your case, at least to me, is the state has taken more than half of your life for a murder that, as we've discussed here, none of the involved players even suggest you were responsible for, and that's the same state, the same country that you volunteered to serve. Do you regret that service at all because of what's happened to you over the last 4 decades?
No. Apples and oranges.
Why?
Because when I went in to serve, that was a decision that I made. Me being incarcerated was a decision that people made about my life. That was the difference.
Well, You're a better man than I in that regard, I should say.
I was born in this country. I live in this country. I love this country. You know, I just don't like how it behaves often.
Well, I hope it behaves differently in your case, Joseph Pope. It's good to meet you. I wish you luck. Jeffrey Harris, good luck with you as well, and I really appreciate your time.
Jim, if I may?
Of course.
I would just like to take a moment to say to all of my brothers and sisters inside and out who are observing Ramadan, Ramadan Mubarak.
Joseph Pope, thank you for your time. Jeffrey Harris, thank you as well.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. A warning before our next segment, some of the images we're going to show are disturbing, including those coming out of Bucha, of mass graves, people bound and shot at close range, signs of mutilation and torture, and descriptions like these from Ukrainian President Zelensky before the UN Security Council today.
Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into the wells, so they died there in suffering. They cut off limbs, cut their throats, slashed their throats. Women were raped and killed in front of their children.
They're descriptions and images that have certainly caught the attention of the media, with headlines like "Images of Dead Civilians in Ukraine Shake the World" and "Up-Close Ukraine Atrocity Photographs Touch a Global Nerve." And the brutality on display has led to intense concern about the fate of those refugees, with the U.S. committing last month to accepting as many as 100,000 people fleeing Ukraine. But what about the many other refugees fleeing violence around the world from places like Syria, Haiti, Central America, which get comparatively less media attention and less consideration by Americans and our leaders? Joining me are Adam Isaacson, he's Director of Defense Oversight for WLA, which advocates for human rights in the Americas, and Daniel Pereira, Communications Director for the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. Daniel, Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Can I get a brief reaction from both of you, Adam, for starts? What's your reaction to President Biden's decision to welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees?
Oh, I think it's the smart decision. You're saving lives. People, if you're a refugee, it actually means you can apply and start the process outside the United States, have your background hopefully quickly checked, and then be able to come to the United States without having to try to do some transatlantic voyage or make your way across Mexico. That is the right way to do it, and I do think it should apply to other countries right now.
Daniel, disagree with any of that? You're nodding your head, apparently in agreement.
Oh yeah, I think that's 100% correct. I think that honestly, the way the Biden administration has reacted to the war in Ukraine and to the refugee crisis that's developing there is, in many ways a model for what we should want to see for conflicts and situations around the world.
Adam, I know you just got back from the border of Texas and Mexico sometime in early March, and I don't think anybody can dispute that not all immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers are created equal in the eyes of our leaders in this country. Based on your firsthand experience, what accounts for the disparate treatment?
We should just be clear here that, U.S. law says that anybody who can set foot on U.S. soil has the right to apply for asylum. That's different than refugee status. You can say, I'm afraid to go back to my country. That doesn't apply to everybody, clearly. It has especially not applied since March of 2020, when a pandemic order called Title 42 said that, because of the pandemic, nobody can ask for asylum. We're going to expel you immediately. Where do they get expelled? Places like where I just was, Tamaulipas, Mexico, which has a state of Mexico, which is the only border state that has a level 4 travel warning from the State Department saying, do not go here. There's kidnapping, there's violence all the time. Yet we are sending tens of thousands of people back into Tamaulipas every day, even if they are trying to ask for protection. Almost none of the people in that part of the border are Ukrainian. Almost all of them are from somewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean. Latin America has 8% of the world's population and more than a third of the world's homicides. A lot of these people probably do have very valid asylum claims that deserve their day in court or due process in the United States. But for more than 2 years now, it's been almost impossible to be heard by a U.S. official when you say you fear for your life.
Well, Adam, staying with you for a second, I think everybody watching remembers the comments that were reported by NBC and others that President Trump, who enacted or at least used Title 42, which Joe Biden has said will expire at the sometime, I believe, later in May. The infamous comment from President Trump about why do we have all these people from shithole nations? Why don't we have more people coming from Norway? It's hard to escape the notion that that's about the color of the skin of the people who are hoping to enter this country. Is that unfair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's fair. It's one of a few reasons, but it's fair. I would say there's three reasons.
What are they?
Right now, Ukrainians are walking right past other nationalities. The first is absolutely racism. You know, darker skinned people, you know, Ukrainians are fair skinned people that look like the dominant ethnicity in the United States. Second is obviously the beginning of this story showed the urgency in the news of, you know, dead bodies on TV in Ukraine. And the third reason, you know, asylum in the United States comes from 1980, the height of the Cold War. And it's in the chip in our brain is that those most deserving of asylum are people fleeing from communism or state oppression. And somebody fleeing, for instance, a gang in Honduras may be in just as much danger, but they don't seem to meet the definition with the same urgency. So those three things mixed together, I think you have to give them all some causal weight.
But, you know, Daniel, it seems, while I'm not in the business that you both are in, there was a comparable urgency for tens of thousands of Haitians. And we all remember the images there, whether they were literally being whipped by people agents on horses or just rounded up by agents with whips on horses. There was an urgency there. That wasn't viewed the same way the urgency for Ukrainians is viewed.
No, it wasn't. And I think part of it is the role that, you know, a number of different groups have played, you know, the media has played, that the government has played, the previous administration, certainly in dehumanizing the people fleeing, catastrophes or political strife in Haiti and Central America and the Caribbean and Africa. The racism is part of it, the dehumanization, sort of, you know, the generic impression of, you know, the refugee or the asylum seeker as this person of color, and you know, we don't really think of them as people at a certain point, or we should, but you know, they're not treated that way in their perception. I think another thing that's important to remember is that dealing with refugee and asylum seekers from these countries often involves reckoning with the United States government's own role in creating the situations that they're fleeing from. You know, I mean, the United States is, you know, the global superpower, but especially with our policy decisions in Central America, in the Caribbean and Haiti, you know, I think that by looking at why people are fleeing, we have to think about, you know, what did the United States do and how did U.S. involvement create the conditions that people are now trying to flee from?
Well, politics also occasionally, I'm not a historian of refugees, but also will occasionally trump race in the case of people coming from Cuba, because that satisfied our political interests. Obviously, we were willing to overlook the fact that the color of their skin was not like ours. You know, Adam, Daniel just mentioned the media, and I don't think the media could have possibly done a better job on the situation in Ukraine than it's done. But the contrast that comes away to me as someone who is in the media is the job that we haven't done with a lot of the populations that you're talking about. And it seems to me if the same attention by the media was paid to people coming from Central America or those Haitian refugees, not for a handful of days, but beyond, and tracked what happened to them when, 10,000 were deported over a period of a month or so, we might have a different reception on the part of the American people and the government. Is that a fair analysis?
That is a more than fair analysis. There was some very good media coverage of those few days in Del Rio, Texas, when Border Patrol people were charging at the Haitians, but there was very little coverage of what happened on the tarmac in Port-au-Prince when 20,000 people were later sort of dumped in very dangerous conditions. Only a few very intrepid reporters have actually gone there. Now, there are some amazingly good reporters working on immigration, working on asylum, and they are some of the most frustrated people as well, because they can really report the heck out of a story, putting a human face on it, and it barely lasts more than a news cycle. 3 days later, it disappears. And an interesting counterexample that I think we all need to look at was the family separations of 2018. Some very gripping photos, some smuggled out audios of crying children, and the whole country stood at attention for a few days because of that very good media coverage. I find, though, that when it doesn't happen on US soil, or when it happens in the middle of the desert, like the 800 or more people that died on US soil in the last year, it's very hard to get attention despite some very good reporters' very good work.
Yeah, one last thing for the two of you, if I can. We mentioned Title 42, and I maybe should have explained it better. A public health measure that allows the traditional rules of asylum to be suspended, at least temporarily. So in the case of people coming across the border from the day that this was started by Donald Trump, and in all fairness, continued by Joe Biden until he made the announcement the other day, people, instead of awaiting their asylum hearing here, ended up in some of the most dangerous parts of Mexico. The good news is that's about to disappear. So I assume more fairness, Daniel, will be invoked. The bad news is, it seems to me, that we are likely to have a rush at our borders that will further inflame the anti-immigration part of our country, both politicians and citizenry, that could make things even worse. What's your analysis, that quickly, if you can, Daniel, of what the end of Title 42's use is going to mean?
Yeah, so I think that first off, it's wonderful that Title 42 is ending. I think that we hope that it ends sooner, that, they're ending it in May, but I think that it could absolutely be taken care of sooner and done away with. I think that one of the things that we're seeing here is the legacy of the gutting of the systems, the structures, the bureaucracies that manage refugees and asylum, applications on the border and across the country. We're dealing and will be dealing with the gutting of those institutions for a long time. The Trump administration did tremendous damage to them, underfunded them, reoriented them in a much more punitive and a much less effective and humanitarian way. And so, I think that it's vital that we staff those agencies, that we provide the resources that we need, and make sure that they are pursuing those missions effectively.
Adam, I only have 30 or 40 seconds. It's cause for celebration, but I assume for much worry as well.
Yeah, it's cause for worry because, if you have 200,000 people coming to the border right now asking for protection, you could have 300,000 or more for at least the first few months after Title 42. Now, if we did what Daniel had talked about, it would be undramatic. People would just line up, and it would be non-chaotic. It would be people just, filling out forms and then having their hearing dates scheduled. No problem, right? But that's just not in place. So the danger is we're going to see scenes of chaos, people crowded into tents, under bridges, and Republicans just making hay of it all the way up to November.
Hope that isn't the case. Adam Isacson, Daniel Pereira, I really appreciate your time. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for tonight. Please come back tomorrow. Former Governor Dukakis joins me on his plans to honor Ukraine's president, and I'm sure another political topic or two. Plus, comedian and storyteller Phoebe Potts on Too Fat for China, her one-woman show about the agonies and joys of adoption. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe.